Okay, so in this video what we're going to cover is how to bind an axis in Axis NOs and to get a plane set up quickly so you can fly it. Our goal always is to try and use Axis NOs to bind everything in an airplane so that there's no use of Microsoft Flight Simulator to control the plane. And there's multiple reasons for that. First is a lot of aircraft interactions aren't even available inside of the controls bindings. You can manipulate and combine interactions and take advantage of hardware that you have. And then finally, you can manage your setups a lot better than Microsoft's convoluted overlapping input binding categories that they use. You can use the events that I'm going to talk about in other apps, but I'll be focusing on Axis NOs in this video. And realize that there's more than one way to do everything. I'm just showing a basic setup of how to do axes in this video, and I'll cover more detail in later videos. In the comments, please ask any questions about approaches that you might need or want, and I'll see if I can figure out how to do a video for that. And use the chapters below so that way you can jump to things if you already know some stuff about Axis NOs and you're just looking for some from detail. And my first recommendation is always to learn the plane first so that way you know what you need to do. Watch a video of someone doing a basic flight with it or something like that. Look at checklists and bring up the checklist and go through it to kind of see what's important. First, let's talk about Axis NOs. Right now it's open. I'm in the sim and I've chosen the Cessna 152 and everything's blank right now. So let's look at some settings that we want to think about before we get into binding stuff. Under the hardware menu, there are two options that are interesting to think of when we're talking about an axis. First is joystick axis high sensitivity. What this does is it doubles the rate at which Axis NOs will pull the axis. So it goes from 18 times a second to 36 times a second. If you find that your inputs are ahead of the airplane, meaning the airplane is lagging behind your inputs, then your computer isn't able to keep up with high sensitivity mode and you should just turn it off. Another thing that you might want to use, I generally have it turned on, and that is lock assignment controls. What that does is it'll stop while you're editing binds and things. It'll stop other things from accidentally rebinding it when you're not paying attention. I'm going to turn it off for this video so it'll make things a little easier for editing stuff, but you'll see this used in later videos. So let's start with setting up simple axes and see how fast we can get this plane working. So we'll go down to the bottom, hit plus. Up at the top, select simulator axis. This is default ones that are often used. Let's pick the Aileron, which is left-right movement in the plane. I'll move my stick left-right. We can see that it showed up. And then I hit add. And now when I move my stick, the yoke moves in the plane. So that's done. We'll go again. Let's do the elevator. Move the stick. Add. Elevator's done. The next one will be the rudder. So we scroll down. We'll find rudder. Move my rudder pedals. Add. And then we look down below, and rudders are often backwards, so you'll have to put a check mark in the reversed option so that way it moves correctly. While we're messing with rudders, let's get our toe brakes set up. So let's do the brake left. So push that, and we can see the left brake works. Brake right. Add. There, it's working. All right, so brakes are done, rudder's done, aileron, elevator. So this is the basics for flying the plane, right? So we've got most of those controls. So the next issue is going to be the throttle lever and mixture lever. Those are two nice ones to also have. So let's start with the throttle lever. So we'll hit add and we'll pick an axis, and we're going to choose throttle 1 because that's the first engine, and then I move an axis and hit add. So some things to pay attention to now. Throttles is where we start to see some kind of weird behaviors. So you can see my axis move all the way from beginning to end, but if we look in the sim, once we get to the 50% mark where the red arrow is, the throttle stops moving. So everything I'm doing down here in this bottom half doesn't do anything in the sim. So there's a couple ways to solve this problem. The kind of quick way would be to grab this red arrow, drag it all the way to the left, and now it'll spread everything out. That's one approach. What you're doing is dragging where the middle point is in the sim and saying, hey, I want the middle point, or the 50%, to be at the beginning of my axis throw. And so that might be something you'll want to do. So that's one kind of quick approach. Another approach is, let's double click on that throttle and look at it. So what we're doing is we were using the basic setup, which is just right up here at the top. Another approach is to use what's called select event, which allows you to look at all axis events or any kind of event that's in the sim. So let's click on that, and then let's filter on throttle, and we'll go to throttle control, throttle here. Throttle control down below is for helicopters, and there's a lot of stuff here. So what you want, the common one that you want is right here, throttle 1 axis set EX1. That one will work, or throttle axis set EX1. Those are usually the same for the first engine or the primary engine of the plane. So we can just pick throttle axis set EX1. So when we do that and hit save, now what you'll notice is that I don't have to move that middle part, and I get movement of the throttle all the way from beginning to end of my throttle. You'll also notice that the numbers change in the bottom. Rather than going from 0 to 1, it's going from 16,000 to negative 16,000. But you get full control now. And this is a nicer approach because now you can move your throttle smaller amounts and get smaller changes in the sim, which is a nice way to go. So the last one to add to the plane will be the mixture lever here. So let's add, click, go to mixture. It's mixture 1. Let's move an axis for that and hit add. And there's our movement. Now you're going to notice the same problem in that the movement of this first half doesn't do anything, but there isn't an extended axis like there is for throttle. So on this one, you're going to be forced to move all the way to the end with the red arrow, and that will get you through all of the basic axis setups. All right, so we can see how quick that is to set up the plane. So let's start going into some details on how these little windows work and what we can do with these axes once we've got them set up to try and fine-tune them. Now we've jumped into a different plane. This is the FlySimWare Sierra C24, and I've done this on purpose because one of the things about the planes that are inside of Microsoft Flight Simulator is they're all encrypted, and that means that you can't get as much information out of them as you can with airplanes that you purchase from developers outside of Microsoft, the store inside of Microsoft Flight Simulator. So if you buy any planes from the store, they'll be encrypted and you can't get as much information from them. And that means it can be harder sometimes to diagnose problems with the plane. For example, when you have developer mode turned on, I show that in the first video, you go to settings, advanced, and there's a little checkbox. You'll get a toolbar at the top of your screen. And in that toolbar, one of the menus is called the debug menu. And under the debug menu is an aircraft menu. And in that is a ton of information about the aircraft. And one that I've grabbed at the moment is called wheels. And you can see it here is the menu for that. And what this is this is showing information related to the wheels and brakes of the airplane. And so when I move my left brake, we can see that it moves, right brake, and it moves. So the first issue that I want you to pay attention to is that when the parking brake is on, which it is in this case, the brakes are set to 100%. And so when I'm pushing on the pedal, it's actually bouncing between whatever that value is, 9, 14%, all the way up to 100 because it's trying to keep the brake on. So turning off the parking brake can help you. So there's the parking brake is off. And now that the parking brake is off, as I move my axis, you can see what kind of output I get from the simulator. You don't get any of this information on an encrypted plane. So keep that in mind. You can't look at what these responses look like in the same way as you can with third-party planes that you purchase and then put into your community folder. So this could be kind of nice for tuning your axes and getting them to behave nicer if you find something's not sensitive enough and things like that. Because right now what we want to cover is how do we modify the details of an axis once we've got it in the sim. I showed you how quick it is to put a basic airplane in with like the Cessna 152. So let's look at some of these options that we have here. So on the aileron, we'll see that I've turned on the curve, so that way it behaves either more or less sensitive at earlier parts of the throttle or the axis throw. And in my case, I'm making it a little less sensitive. This has got a slightly downward curve to it. If you mouse over it and scroll, you can see I can change that curve to different values. Now, that's not outrageously detailed. We can get at that value if we just double click on it, and you can see the curve shape is right here. And so if we have a really steep curve here, you'll see that that number, I turned off the curve here, that number is really high, 4.5. And if we go steep in the other direction, it's really small, 0.2. And if we have no curve at all, which is this red line, then it's a 1. So anything less than 1 means the axis will be more sensitive. Anything greater than 1, it'll be less sensitive. And so in this case, I wanted it to be a little less sensitive with the ailerons. Down here, let's see here, let's find our, let's see here, I've got the brakes. So you'll see that I've chosen a not default brake axis. I've actually chosen the axis propeller set 1. Took a little bit of hunting to find it for this plane. And so that's what we're using for the brakes. You can see that even though it says propeller 1 set, we're getting brake input for that. And so that's a thing to keep in mind with some of these planes. Is every developer is different as to where they put stuff. And this is where I found it for the Sierra. And you'll notice that I've made this much more sensitive. I've scaled it up. So that means smaller movements of my pedal give bigger movements of the brake. And that's mostly because of the way I have my throttle pedal set up and how I sit. I can't rotate my foot as far forward because I'm more leaning back. And so therefore I made it more sensitive so I get a little access to some more brakes. Some planes have almost like an on-off on their brakes, and so it doesn't matter what sensitivity you put in here, it will just be on or off. Another thing to look at are these numbers at the bottom. This shows you where what the current value is in the middle. The smallest value, -1, largest value, +1. So as you're moving the aileron left and right, it'll show that current value in the middle of what it's sending to the simulator and what your limits are. These blue arrows will create dead zones. So that way, if you've got, let's say, a noisy axis and it's bouncing around at the bottom, then it'll stop once you get to there. So that way you don't have to go as far to get your maximum travel in the sim, and you get away from that noisy section of your device if you've got kind of a noisy potentiometer in there. So these blue arrows are nice for that. Another thing to kind of think about with these blue arrows is they limit axis travel. And so what we'll end up using this for later is we can divide an axis. So you could have your aileron broken up between two different inputs and then just use the blue triangles so that way different regions send out different numbers. Where this happens most often is in the throttle. So you would go to the throttle and you could break up your throttle and have one portion of your throttle go to, let's say, normal engines forward, but then another portion go to reversers or things like that. And we'll cover that in a later section. So what else? We have the raw. If you click on raw, it'll bring up a submenu which allows you to see how your inputs are translated. It allows you to play with the left and right blue arrows. That's what these margins are, where the center point is, how big of a dead zone you have there, and whether that dead zone is nonlinear. So that means that it puts a curve on it. You can also add detents in, which is kind of like throttle one, like if you had throttle settings, you could imagine, let's say, cruise, climb, toga, things like that. You can actually create detents so that way it'll hit those values within the sim. And we'll cover that with a separate airplane later in more advanced usage of axes. We've already talked about reversing axes. We had to do that with our rudder pedals. And the red arrow at the top sets where the center point is for your axis. Now you'll also see when you click on an axis, it gets that color red. Those are control layers. Right now I don't have any control layers turned on for this plane. So or actually it's showing you which ones are selected, but there are control layers on the left side here. See 1, 2, 3, and so you can set these to different control layers. And again, we'll talk about that in some advanced axis setups. The next thing we'll want to do is start looking at the detail panel for an axis. So if you double click on an axis, it brings this back up. We saw this initially when we were setting up the Cessna 152, and we just used the top option of setting an axis. Because that's most commonly what's going to solve your problem. But there's a ton of information in here that we can use to help tune the axis. When you're doing, I showed you with the brakes where you can use developer mode. You can also go to aircraft and aircraft data. That's another window. This is again under the debug menu in developer mode. This is handy because it'll show axes that you want to look at. So we can click on the down arrow here and let's look at the aileron deflection. And we'll put that on there and then we'll set this one to none. So now when we look at the aileron deflection, I think I actually have to cancel this so it'll send it to the sim. There it goes. And so we can see it moving here. Let's get this window over a little bit more. and bring up axis and O's again. All right, so you can see as I move the aileron, what kind of input it's providing to the sim. So again, you don't get this information with encrypted planes, but with third-party planes, you can see this information. So it's real handy for kind of just seeing how quickly your control maxes out. And if you want to apply a response curve, you can, look at your response curves that we're doing up here in the corner, and kind of see how that behavior translates to the sim in getting movement of the plane surfaces. So let's double click again on this and start looking at some of the details here and see what kind of options that we have. So up at the top was our default axes. The second option is selecting events. This allows us to dig inside of Microsoft Flight Simulator and look for anything related to the aileron. We just type it in, hit filter, and we can see there's a lot of options. Here's the default one. We can see there's some here. Most of these are not axis related. We can see axis aileron set, but outside of that, a lot of these are related to trim or actually just setting certain values for the aileron, which generally we won't touch. And then the rest of this stuff, we can see how there's some axis and O's does some mouse control. So you can use a mouse to control your ailerons and yoke. And then we can see rudder trim, which has the word aileron in it. So that's why that came up. So this is where you can find some of those other axes that are there. Another option is entering a variable. So if you click on this, now what it'll do is it'll bring up all of the variables that are in the sim. Now you'll notice that the L variables are relatively blank, meaning that I can see my input events. We've talked about this in the first video. So B events or B variables and input events, IEs. But I don't see any plane related L variables yet. And that's because I have not run the read L variables from the sim. Now we'll do this, and it might take a second. I'm going to click on it, and it says collecting LVARs. Please wait. So we'll wait for that, and hopefully it won't take too long. There's not much you can do until this is done. There can be sometimes thousands of LVARs, and it can take a long time. That's why neither SPAD Next or Axis and O's does it by default, because it just creates a ton of lag within the sim and possibly your computer while it's doing this, because it has to search so many variables. Another thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about LVARs and stuff is when you're editing LVAR variables in your binds, and you click on one to change it to a different one, you're going to get lag again as it has to filter through thousands of LVARs. So just keep that in mind. It's just part of the process of trying to find all these variables because there's so many of them. So now that I've done that, if I go back to here and we go to enter variable, I can click on the plus, and now I get a new category called local simulator variables. We'll try aileron here and see, and we can see that it filtered out, and we see there's an LVAR for the aileron trim switch here. So if we had an axis that we wanted to put data into the trim switch, you could select that here, and it would dump whatever your axis is set to into that variable. There are some things that you should think about though when doing something like that, and that is this variable may or may not control exactly what you want. So you definitely have to explore with developer mode to make sure you're picking the right variable. The values that you put in may or may not make sense. And so you'll have to pay attention to what the access minimum and maximum are. You can double click on these to change these numbers. If you need it to, let's say, be a number between -1 and 1, then you double click on it, make it -1 and 1, and that will keep the number between those two values. And down here, update value. Usually you want it on changed. It just means when the axis changes, that's when you send up the new value to your variable or your axis. And in this case, if we look at rounding, you can see how it says integer. In this case, it's going to literally only give the values of 0, -1, and 1. If you wanted everything in between, like 0.89, then you're going to want that to be a float. So that way you get those small decimal values rather than being rounded to the next integer. Virtual events. So virtual events allow you to do keyboards, joystick buttons, Xbox controller buttons, mouse actions, all things like that. So that means when you move your axis, it actually does like moving the mouse if you wanted to. There's all kinds of stuff that you can do in there. As we go through here, we can reverse it here. Filtering, this averages out your axis. If you've got a noisy axis that even while you're moving it, so if I hit cancel here, and you can see, so with my stick, I have a Virpil stick, and I'm holding it at a certain deflection, and it's 4.2, and it's not moving. But if you find that when you're holding it at a certain value that you're getting this, you're getting small wiggles because you have a noisy potentiometer. In my case, I'm wiggling my hand, but sometimes you get noisy potentiometers that do this. And in that case, then turning on a filter and having this filter be a higher number could be some value there and smoothing out that axis. And there's two different averaging methods that are offered, a linear and a progressive average. So noisy axis, dig into there. I already talked about, I usually do on change, and often it's float. This just shows you what device you currently have it bound to. If you want to lock it, you can lock it. You can, hit X and get rid of it, and then rebind it. So move an axis. I just got rid of it and then moved my axis again. Here you can modify the blue arrows and red arrows that we talked about before. The left and right margin is the blue arrows. Your center mark is that red arrow. You'll see how it defaults to 50%. Combo button. So this is handy if you basically are setting a different button that you have to press. So I'm going to click in here and then press a button. So I have to press button 3 in order for this axis to actually work. And so you may or may not want something like that for some reason. And you can actually turn it on to where this little checkbox, suppress axis. That means when you press this button, the axis doesn't work. And when you're not pressing the button, the axis does work. So it's an opposite kind of an effect. And then toggling means you don't have to hold the button down for it to work. You can just click it and then click it again, and then you get the behavior to go back and forth. Combo variable. So what this is that you would have to have a custom variable, and you set that value to either 1 or 0. If it's a 1, then the axis will work. If it's a 0, then the axis won't work. It's just another way to control when your axis becomes available, and maybe for some special airplanes that could be necessary. Control layer, you can go through the 4 different control layers. By default, everything is control layer 0, which is the nothing layer, and then you have control layer 1, 2, and 3. We'll use control layers to split up a throttle axis to create reversers and stuff like that. Pretty handy. And then finally, a label. You can give it an optional label, especially if you do something fancy to it and you want to remind yourself of what you did. You can label it here rather than having whatever the default label is, which is usually the name of the thing up here. So now we've jumped planes, and we are now in the black square Starship. As of this recording, the Starship's been out almost a week. And it's a good example of where I wanted to make the throttle match the behavior of my physical throttle that I have. So in my case, my throttle has detents in it. And that means that as I move my throttle forward, it has a physical bump or stop that I can feel as I'm moving the throttle forward. and I wanted those bumps that exist in there, those detents, to match this physical airplane. And so I needed to figure out, where are these spots, so that way when it stops in the real world for me in my cockpit, that it stops for the plane. And so what we'll look at over here are two of these. I have throttle left and throttle left beta. And so, and I've broken up that, it's all the same throttle axis. So if I double click on it, you can see it's throttle 1 for throttle left. And when I double click on this one, it's also a throttle 1. So it's all controlling the same axis. It's just that I've broken up what part of the axis it's at and then where the axis starts and ends. So if we look at throttle left, we will see that it starts, the minimum value of that axis is 0.17 and the maximum is 1. And so I found the 0.17 by just going into the sim and looking at the throttle. We can do that in developer mode. If you remember, we turn that on, Control G on an item if we have behaviors turned on. So let's turn on behaviors, and we'll hit Control G, and then that brings up the behaviors window. And I think at the bottom, so if we look at the bottom of the mouse rect section, there's often a value here that we can look at. And so we can see currently it's at negative 0.3, there's 0. And then as you move it forward, we can see that how it changes. And so we can see that when we get to the idle stop, it's at about 0.17, 0.18. And so right here, 0.17, I am at the bottom of idle. And then as I move my physical throttle in the real world down to my next detent, which in my case is actually kind of a bit of a distance, it goes from idle to the ground find position, which I have found to be at about, that was here, was it negative 0.15 or something like that? And then we can see here, percent is at, it's about 12%. Interesting. All right. So, and then all the way back is 0. And we can see the negative 15 there. So negative 15, somewhere right around 0. And then it jumps, and then it goes all the way up. So I just played with the throttle and I looked at those values, and then I used those values to help me set up my throttle in Axis and O's. If we go down into the input events, you can also see your throttle percentage here. And so it's really just copying that number that's in the mouse rect, and it's just that percentage. And so you can use that also. So let's hide this, bring back here, and let's look at what's being sent to the sim. So right now we're going from on throttle left. So this bottom value is 0.17. Maximum value is 1. And you can see I've got the blue triangle set, and this bottom blue triangle is where my the middle of my throttle is, where that detent is, where I want it to be. And so then I move my hand down in the real world and I hit my next detent, and you'll see it jumps down because it's kind of like a finger lift in the sim. It finger lifts up into this ground find position, and then that starts at 0.15. And I want the whole axis to be where I don't want this middle spot. I want it to be right at the end, so that way I get this full distance. And so now I have full control of my beta range, and it goes from the negative 0.15 up to that maximum, which is 0. So that's how you break up an axis and have it match the physical detents that you might have in the real world. All right, the next step that we have for looking at axis binding, we are in FlySimWare's Learjet, and in this airplane we have a thrust reversers. So this is the thrust reversers are on the same axis as the main throttle. So if I look at throttle 1, we can see it's throttle 1. In this case, it goes from -1 to 1. And then if we look down here, we'll see throttle 1 again, -1 to 1. And so that's the same axis for these. But what you'll notice is that I, just like the Starship, I've split the axis. So the top half is throttle 1 up here. And so this will be for forward throttle on the airplane. And then when it gets to the bottom, that's where we're at 0 throttle now. And if I continue moving my throttle in the real world, I'd be entering in reverse thrust land. And so that's not something you want to accidentally go into, obviously. And so the detent in my case isn't a finger lift on my physical throttle. It's just a little bump. So if I accidentally pass back, if I'm going to low throttle and I pass through that, I don't want to go into reverse thrust. Now with the Lear, you would have to actually arm the reverse thrusters and things like that. But regardless, you don't want to accidentally enter beta range or reverse thrust. So this is one way to stop that, and that's to use control layers. So you'll see that just like with the Starship, we've split the axis, so it's the same axis twice, and I've just used the blue triangles to divide the axis in half. Now what I do is I need to access this second layer. So I've clicked on it to make it layer 1. And so how do we get access to that? So we need a bind for that. And our bind is down here. It is throttle reverse thrust toggle is what I called it. Let's bring it up and look at it. So the event that I'm using is a standard event. It's called a native event. It is in the Axis and O's control layer. So this is not something that's a part of Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's a part of Axis and O's. And so one of the set of commands that are available to you is manipulating your control layers. And so I only have one control layer here, which is the yellow one. And so axis layer up will increment from 0 to 1. But if there's nothing left, meaning there's not additional ones, it bounces. If you press it again, it just goes back from 1 to 0. So it circles on itself. And so I've bound that to a button on my throttle. And so now when I push it, you'll notice that we get a yellow highlight all the way around here. And now when I push my throttle forward, nothing happens at all. And that's because that region isn't defined for here, right? We've broken up the throttle to only take effect when I hit that 50% mark. And now you'll notice as I move backward into this negative range, the throttle changes. Ignore the little animation skipping. That's just an animation issue. That's nothing to do with the physical throttle. The values are changing smoothly within the sim. And let me check real quick if we can show you that. Okay, so what I did is I brought up the behaviors again, and then I put my mouse over the top of the reverse throttle and hit Control G so we can bring that up. Again, we're looking at the mouse rect section where we can get the value and the input value. And while you see a tiny bit of fluttering or maybe noise related to it, it's really small. You're talking fractions of a percent. But as I back up my throttle into this, you can see that it's smoothly getting values from 0 to 100. And so you can control your reverse thrust really well and smoothly, even if the animation of the throttle levers sometimes bounce around and stuff like that. That's nothing really to worry about there. So let's close this and bring up axis and O's again. So remember, we're in the yellow control layer. So if I'm done with my throttle reverse and I want to go back to controlling the plane, I just tap my button and now I'm back into it. So you can do it pretty quickly. So on landing, you can imagine you're bringing the throttle down. We go into like maybe 0 throttle right at the end of landing, just at touchdown, and then I tap, and then I can go back into reverse thrust. My plane slows down, I push back, tap, and then I'm back in. And so it's a pretty smooth interaction between the two. While we're here and dealing with the Learjet, we might as well talk about accessing cutoff. So in this case, while I can get to idle, cutoff is a completely different thing for the throttle. And so what we'll have here is I've got a cutoff bind. And so up here you can see I've got engine left cutoff toggle, engine right cutoff toggle. And so if I click on that, you can see there's an event. It's called generic Lear shutoff 1 toggle. So it's a BVAR that was there. And when I press it, it'll bounce you between cutoff and not cutoff. And then I wanted the same button to control the other one too. So what I did in that case is it's bound to shutoff 2, but you'll notice down here there is a combo button that I press. So I have on my throttle, I have a pinky and a thumb button. So the thumb button is my toggle to go in and out of cutoff, and then the pinky button is the modifier between engine 1 and 2. So I just press the pinky button, I've got it held down, and then I press my cutoff and it goes to the right engine. So that way I can quickly go between those two engines. Okay, so then the next kind of thing that we might want to look at is assigning an axis to something like the brightness knob for display brightnesses or anything like that in the sim. So now we're going to take a smooth axis that's in the real world, driven by usually a potentiometer, and then we're going to have it push values out that make sense to something that has, let's say, a range of values from 0 to 100. So these brightness knobs in the SWS's Pilatus PC12, they control the pilot and co-pilot display brightness. And if I click on it, I can see it goes from 100 to 0. If we bring up the behaviors window, remember we can see behavior in there, our mouse rect. So I'll click, drag to 100, drag to 0. I can see the value goes from 0 to 100. So I know in axis and O's, I'm going to have to put out between 0 and 100. So let's bring up axis and O's, and you will see that I have created a bind, and when we open it up, I've bound it to an axis, and I've set the minimum on that axis to 0 and the maximum to 100 because those are the values that I want. Only integer values make sense because 1.5 doesn't make sense for this. It's always going to be solid or single percentage numbers. So I have it set rounding to integer, and we have it update on change. So that gets us our numbers. Now the question is, how do we get it onto these knobs? So if we go back to our behavior viewer and Control G on the knob, and we look, we see that B lighting potentiometer 2 is for that one, and if I grab the bottom knob of the knob, we see it's potentiometer 1. So this is our BVAR that we want to target. Again, it's probably more simplified up in the update codes. So B lighting potentiometer 1 and 2. So those are the ones we want to get. So Now, if we just wanted to control a single object, a single one of these displays, you could choose that event here. So you would just go to here, and we go to lighting, and we look through and we find the potentiometer that we wanted. It was potentiometer 1 and 2. So there it is right there. Let's say I just wanted to modify potentiometer 1. I would hit that and hit OK. I didn't do that though. We're going to do both of them at the same time. So this will show you how to push these values out, not only to something that's in the sim, but to target more than one thing at a time. And so you'll notice that the select event, I have it chosen to hit a script. So let's look at our scripts. So under scripting, there's a thing called the script editor. We're going to cover the script editor in a lot more detail later, but in this case, I've got a category for the PC-12, and I have a script for my lighting change, and I've called it lighting PFD MFD. And there are actually 4 different things that I wanted to control with this knob, because they're all related to the displays on the instrument panel. And so I found out what those input events were. So potentiometer 1, 2, we already looked at those, but there's also 8 and 9. And what you'll notice here is that I have placed an LVAR in the beginning called L:PC-12 lighting space PFD space MFD. So the first part, the PC-12, that's just the name of the category that you're using in your scripts. So the name of my category is PC-12. So that's what goes after the L variable is PC-12. Then it's followed by a hyphen, and then you give it the name of whatever script you named it. I named it lighting space PFD space MFD. So then you put the name of the script in there. Put a space in between the two. That space is important. And then we use the greater than symbol to dump the value of this variable into this variable, or this event in this case. And so it's better to target events than specific variables. That way you kind of have a better chance of it doing everything, like animating and so forth. So that's why I chose the IE rather than just the B variable here. So you'll see that I have 4 of them there, because I want to update all 4 of them, and they're all pulling from this same value here, this LPC-12. So where did this come from, this LVAR? So let's go back to our axis, and you'll notice that select event, it's script PC-12. So when I click on this, rather than choosing an event or a native event, I chose scripts, and then I found the script that I had created, PC-12, and I found my PFD MFD, and it looks like this. Now, anytime that you point an axis to a script, you get a variable for free, and that is the name of the category, the name of the script as an LVAR. And that's just an axis and O's LVAR. It's not inside the simulator, it's just inside the app. And so now what'll happen is whatever number we're spitting out on our axis gets dumped into that script as this variable, and we can do anything we want with it. In this case, we're going to dump it into these lighting values. And so now if I put my mouse over this, and then I have a knob on one of my controllers, and then I spin that knob, and it's a nice smooth change all the way up and down. You can see maybe barely that the knob is animating, and if I mouse over, the other one is changing too, and so they have the same value. They're both getting updated at the same time, and so that shows you how you can target an axis to a physical object and have it put exactly the numbers you want into it in the sim. So in this last one, we're going to go through the doozy that is the Aileron Rudder Interconnect that exists for the SWS PC-12, which is a true feature of the airplane, which means that when you put in aileron input or rudder input, it'll blend those two together and provide inputs to the other control surface, and it helps make flying smoother and more coordinated. And so this is where it pays dividends to dig into the manual, right? They give us two manuals. First is a bindings manual, and it gives us some information as to like how you can disconnect these two, because sometimes that causes problems, especially for force feedback. They say over here that there's some Brunner force feedback yokes, and they need these variables separated. So they give you the two variables, and they show you there's a aileron input, a rudder input, and you can basically target those so that way you can escape the blending that occurs. That's not what we want to do here. We want the plane to fly like the normal airplane, and so we want that blending to exist. But it's important to know that these variables exist because it might help us find other information. The next thing is going into the main manual itself, and there is a section on the interconnect, and it says that this interconnect is 1-to-1. That means the amount of deflection that you get is the same for both surfaces if you're below 25 knots. And then as you speed up, then you get less blending between the two up to, above 150 knots. It's really small. So that means we're going to have a couple jump cuts here, so you can kind of see how it behaves between the two. So that's our manual to help us understand how it behaves and maybe some variables that are involved. I did some more digging on the internet, and then I found that there is a file. It's called the exterior XML. It's located in your community folder, and inside that file, this exterior file, it gives information about the rudder aileron interconnect. And the reason why I found it is because there is a true false variable in here, and the developers put it out there and said, hey, if you don't want this blending at all, then come to this file and change this true to a false, and that will get rid of the blending completely, and it'll behave like a different airplane. That's not what we want to do, but you can see in here how there is some information as to how it blends the two, and that kind of stuff. We won't touch any of this because this is the default, but it just shows you that there's more information there, and some variables that might be interesting, such as this yaw damper pedal output. So let's hide that. And we won't need the behavior window for right now. Okay, so let's go back to Axis and O's and see what we've got set up there. So there's a few things going on. So you'll notice that I have an aileron interconnect, and down here I have a rudder interconnect. And those are set up like we did before when we were using the knob to a script approach. And so you'll see here where I'm doing an event and it's pointing to a script, and I made a script for each of these situations, for the aileron and for the rudder. And I won't go into too much details as to like how I came up with the code. I actually had some help from the developer of Axis and O's, and he helped formulate this. And so his forum is great. He's got the patience of a saint, and so asking questions there often gets a relatively quick response. And so what you'll see here in this script, it's the aileron interconnect script that I'm pointing to for my axis. And again, this axis is set up to the left-right on my stick control. And what it does is it takes the value of that axis, which as you can see goes from -100 to 100 because it's a percent axis. It you know it wants a percentage to go from left to right, and then it takes that and it puts it into this aileron input variable that is inside the sim, and it does a comparison of two variables and looks at the absolute value because it doesn't care about what sign it is, but it's trying to figure out which one's the bigger one. And then whatever the bigger one is, then it dumps that value into here, which is the interconnect. And the reason why we want to compare these two is that if I'm putting in rudder and my rudder exceeds my aileron input, then that rudder should be the thing that we look at when we dump it into their handling variable, which is this one that I've got highlighted there. And vice versa. If the aileron exceeds the rudder, then the aileron is what matters. And how I really kind of figured out how that behaves is I brought up those variables using the variable watcher for axis and O's. I cover that in the very first video. And so I've added variables here. And then I had the plane and I just did the standard Microsoft Flight Simulator binding, and then it did its blending and I could watch these values and see how they change. And so that's how I know that what I'm doing has the same effect as what was originally there. So what you can see here is I'm watching these individual inputs, the aileron and the rudder. This is what they provided in the documentation for the force feedback stick. And for giggles, we've got the yaw damper adjusted. The yaw damper is not on, the plane is off, so right now this is doing nothing. And then there is that handling aileron rudder interconnect number. This is the thing that is the blending. And then we can see what our actual surface deflection is between the two. So right now, tiny bit of noise at 0 there. Let me move my rudder pedals. Okay, so rudder pedals are at 0. My stick has a tiny bit, you know, when I say tiny, I mean we're looking at millionths of a value there, right? 0.000031. But so right now we have two numbers here. You'll notice that the aileron is bigger than the rudder, and so the aileron value is passed into this interconnect value. And we can see that my ailerons in the sim are deflected by this tiny amount. If I start adding rudder, we'll see that the rudder value changes. And I'll hold it still here kind of. So we can see that rudder value now is at 0.4, and it is now bigger as a number than this 0.00031, and so we can see that 0.4 is placed into all three of these variables. And then we can see that my aileron is also changed, and when it gets to really high values, then it's a large value. So 0.8, 0.8, 0.5, 0.3. And so we can see how that deflection changes. And so as you can see, I'm just moving my rudder pedal, but up above behind here, you can see the yoke is moving around also at the same time. And so at less than 25 knots, these are a 1-to-1 blending, and that appears to be handled by this handling aileron rudder interconnect variable. So so now let's pause real quick and get into the air. All right, so now we're flying in the airplane, and we can see that I've got basically no inputs here. Airplane is flying pretty level, and we can see that I have a tiny bit of aileron here, but it's that same number. Now I'm going to add, I'm flying right now. If we look at my speed, I'm at over 150 knots. If you remember, there's very little blending at over 150 knots. So let's give it a lot of rudder and look at what happens. So I'm going to give it a lot of rudder, and let's pause the sim for a second here. So you can see that the rudder input is at almost 70%, but the aileron deflection is actually much, much smaller. It's only at 0.09%. So you can see at high speeds, this blending is not as significant. And I don't know if I'll be able to, let's see if we can get to a, oh yeah, don't want to do that. Let's try and slow down a little bit and see if we can get below 150 and notice if the value is different. So let's add some flaps to get ourselves a little bit slower here. All right, so now we're below 150 knots. We're at about, there we go. Yeah, some gear warning. Might as well put the gear down. Okay, so now let's add our rudder and pause again. So again, now if you look, we've got 88% on the rudder, 12% on the aileron. And so there's still some of that blending. Let's see if we can get it back to, what was it, 60 some percent. Let's see here. So 65% gives me 20%. So now I've doubled. Remember, we're at a slower speed, so the blending is higher. So now I'm getting kind of double the input on the aileron from that rudder. And that shows that that blending is changing as our speed changes. So this is kind of like the most, I don't know, advanced thing I've done so far as it relates to axis mapping and dealing with this blending between two different control surfaces. But if you take some time and do the research, you can figure out how these things work, and you can manipulate them with axis and O's and get your controls to behave exactly like you want outside of the simulator. So hopefully this long journey, this huge video with increasing kind of complexity of controls gives you a basis to work from in how to handle axes in axis and O's.